Imagine a world where, instead of Byakuya, it was Kenpachi who fought Tsukishima at the end of the Lost Agent arc. How differently would things have turned out? Would the captain of the 11th Division be able to defeat Ichigo's terrifying nemesis, or would he have fallen prey to Book of the End? Obviously, narratively, it makes sense for it to be Byakuya who faces Tsukishima due to Byakuya's character development and his evolving relationship with Ichigo, but just for fun, what if he and Kenpachi had swapped places? Of course, what makes this fun is that this exact scenario is what Kenpachi tried to make happen in the manga itself. In chapter 463, as the Shinigami are paired off with their Fullbringer opponents, Byakuya is approached by Tsukishima, as the two of them are sealed away in one of Yukio's chat room arenas. However, Kenpachi, unhappy with the prospect of facing Giriko, demands that Byakuya switch places with him, as Tsukishima looks to be the stronger enemy. But before he can, the room seals shut around Byakuya. Though I've always loved Byakuya's little glance he gives Kenpachi as the chat room closes, it's always felt to me like Byakuya wanted to face Tsukishima himself due to everything that he'd done to Ichigo, and it's confirmed as much in the following chapter when Byakuya basically completely trash talks Tsukishima, calling him a coward and a despicable fighter. Considering Byakuya vs Tsukishima would turn out to be my favourite fight of the arc, let's just say I'm pretty happy with how things ended up. But with this potential what-if scenario, there's quite a bit to look at here, including one pivotal question that will decide everything. How would Book of the End affect Kenpachi? In fact, how would cutting Kenpachi affect Tsukishima? And would he even be able to land a hit before being killed? So, without further ado, let's take a look. Kenpachi vs Tsukishima should be interesting, and the fights that can potentially be decided by a single strike are always fun. If you enjoyed today's video, consider hitting subscribe down below before you go. It really does help out a lot, and it does help the channel to grow, so I do greatly appreciate it. I have to admit, this is an oddly nostalgic setup for me personally. For those of you who don't know, I used to draw a lot of what-if manga chapters, mostly after Bleach ended, but a fair few beforehand as well, for things we either didn't see in Bleach or potential battles that would have been fun, or could have been fun, and the very first one I ever drew was Byakuya vs Giriko, if he and Kenpachi had swapped places. That was back in early 2012, I think, around the time the Thousand Year Blood War arc began, so it was pretty soon after the battles against Execution actually took place in the manga. And they look absolutely horrible these days, but yeah, it's fun to kind of go back to this idea 13 years later or so, but this time we're looking at the other side of the coin, which is Kenpachi versus Tsukishima. So Kenpachi steps in before Yukio has a chance to activate the chat rooms and demands that Byakuya switch opponents with him. Uninterested in quarrelling with the boisterous captain, Byakuya simply steps aside, remarking that it makes no difference to him either way, and faces down Giriko instead, while Kenpachi prepares to take on Tsukishima like he wanted. And maybe we'll look at a potential Byakuya versus Giriko in the future, although I think it's going to go pretty much how you'd expect. The first big question we need to ask is, how does Kenpachi approach this fight? His instincts are correctly telling him that Tsukishima is a stronger opponent than Giriko, but what does that really mean? Stronger how? In the face of Kenpachi's own strength, I have to imagine the difference between Tsukishima and Giriko is fairly negligible, so it almost feels like Kenpachi was somehow able to glean that Tsukishima has an incredibly strong Fullbring. That being said, I don't think it's completely fair to dismiss Giriko's Fullbring as weak either, as I feel like Kubo really kind of lumped him with the short straw in the end, and it absolutely feels like there is so much more to Time Tells No Lies that we simply didn't see. Whereas we have a very solid, all-encompassing understanding of Book of the End and its absurd power, which of course we'll get into. I guess Kenpachi could be acting based on the data the Shinigami already have. It is clear after they arrive that they at the very least know what Tsukishima's ability is on a surface level, as apparently I think Urahara told them, though would Kenpachi really have paid attention to any of that? And the way he says Tsukishima seems stronger makes me think it is all based on battle instinct. Anyway, in chapter 464, as Byakuya prepares to face off against Tsukishima, he actually breaks down why he thinks Kenpachi would have made for a poor opponent for the Fullbringer, noting the captain loves a bloodbath, and as a result he matches up badly against Tsukishima's power to end the fight in a single swing. Byakuya remarks that Kenpachi is an even worse choice than Ichigo, and so at this point it was logical to assume back in the day, Byakuya's means of fighting Tsukishima would be to stay far away from him, and we know that's highly possible thanks to how Senbon Sakura works, which Tsukishima himself even comments on, wondering if the way Byakuya is speaking implies that Byakuya will never be touched by his sword, only for Byakuya to block the blade with Senbon Sakura. This is Kubo rather cleverly luring us into a false sense of security regarding how this fight might play out, but of course the fight doesn't go quite that smoothly for Byakuya, and what makes the battle so good is how it continues to, at least in my opinion, defy expectations. I like how Kubo organically ramps things up by allowing the worst possible outcome to actually happen, which is Byakuya being cut by Book of the End, taking the fight to its logical conclusion. Now, you could argue the way Tsukishima uses Book of the End in this fight doesn't really make sense, and we'll get into some of that, but I'm not sure I agree. I think it actually works very well from the perspective of Tsukishima actually trying to outright kill his opponent in a battle situation. Anyway, we'll get to Book of the End later. For now, like I said, how does Kenpachi approach this fight? A crucial thing to remember is that Tsukishima has absolutely no idea who he's up against until he manages to land a hit on his opponent. It was the same for Byakuya. Unlike the Shinigami, the Fullbringers don't have the intel on the captains, at least as far as we know. Though one could argue Byakuya revealed his hand early by using Shikai to block Tsukishima's strike. Now, if Kenpachi does in fact know what Tsukishima can do, it would be interesting to see him offer Tsukishima, the same first strike opportunity that he offered Ichigo back in the Soul Society arc, as though daring the Fullbringer to try and cut him. However, seeing how Tsukishima immediately went on the offensive against Byakuya before discovering the power of his Zanpakuto, I wonder if he might actually take Kenpachi up on his offer? But that being said though, once Tsukishima sees what Senbon Sakura can do, he immediately becomes extremely cautious, as is even noted by Byakuya, not moving into the captain's range until he uses Book of the End to set up a few traps for Byakuya to later trigger. Anyway, dialing it back, I can see Tsukishima remarking that Kenpachi is a fool for giving him such an opening, wondering if he knows what his Fullbring's ability is or not. And while I think that Tsukishima would certainly take a minute or so to assess the situation, wondering if there is some trick perhaps to what Kenpachi is doing, eventually Kenpachi, holding his Shihakusho open, would eventually bark at him for wasting his time, and if he's not going to take him up on his offer, then eventually he's going to come and cut him instead. So Tsukishima closes the gap and swings his blade. But wait, does Book of the End even play by the normal rules? We know that Book of the End has two separate modes, essentially. There's the mode where it's just a normal sword and cuts things as a sword would, but then there's the mode where it inserts Tsukishima into the victim's past, its actual ability, and when this happens, the blade doesn't actually leave a wound per se, not a physical one anyway. It's as though the blade was never there. Does this mean the cutting property of the blade is different in this moment? And by the way, it's a little weird that when Tsukishima slashes Byakuya across the chest, thereby scoring that decisive hit and inserting himself into Byakuya's past, it's a little weird that Byakuya is actually cut and that wound remains throughout the battle, as though Tsukishima used the two modes at once. Which I guess we were never told wasn't possible, I suppose, though Riruka does explicitly point out later in the arc that there are two different styles of cutting with Book of the End. Anyway, let's say Tsukishima doesn't manage to cut through Kenpachi's skin. At this point, he retreats and goes on the run until he can come up with a suitable plan. Again, Tsukishima's biggest advantage here is that Book of the End essentially allows him to do anything at all. And that includes warping the arena to his liking, essentially, so he can set, presumably, any kind of trap he wants in their arena, just as he does against Byakuya. And to be honest, he could have probably gone a lot harder with the traps against Byakuya than he actually did. Remember, due to Book of the End's ability, which is one of the most broken in the series, I won't be able to, I won't be able to state that enough, to be honest. Tsukishima can visit the past of even a place like Yukio's chat room, which is brand new, and spend as much time in the past as he likes doing whatever he likes, because technically it's already happened. But in the present, it occurs in the blink of an eye. So Tsukishima could feasibly create a litany of traps for Kenpachi, and they could be basically anything as far as we know. There's nothing to say it's not possible, which is kind of what Tsukishima says to Byakuya at one point. Byakuya says, "So your ability works even on inanimate objects," to which Tsukishima simply replies, "I don't remember ever saying it didn't," which is hilarious and very much encapsulates what I think kind of annoyed people about Tsukishima, though I always loved his character, was that he almost felt like a bit of a troll and someone who was playing with the very fabric of the almost meta-narrative of Bleach and the universe it was set in itself, which I always really liked, but it did kind of feel like Kubo could do whatever he liked with this guy and get away with it. A little like someone like Mayuri, I guess, but in a different kind of way. But anyway, in the moment, Tsukishima needs to keep moving, because to be honest, until he successfully does manage to insert himself into Kenpachi's past, I think Kenpachi could kill him with a single hit, just like he did to Giriko. While Tsukishima is obviously physically much weaker than Kenpachi, just as he was Byakuya, I think we shouldn't underestimate him either. He was fast enough to blitz Byakuya before he'd even cut him, managing to catch the captain's arm in mid-air and then land a strike on him too. Tsukishima later reveals that the reason he was able to do this was because Byakuya hesitated upon realizing that Tsukishima had discovered the safe zone exploit of Senbon Zakura, which again we'll get into. But if Tsukishima is able to discover some kind of an exploit against Kenpachi that literally no one has ever done before, we can't discount the fact that Kenpachi may also hesitate in such a way as well. It would be akin to his battle against Unohana, where for a moment he is shocked and he's thinking to himself about what's going on when he seems to keep waking up after falling asleep, and he has no idea what's actually happening, and eventually shakes himself out of that and realizes he needs to focus on the fight. That does tell me that even Kenpachi is susceptible to the occasional hesitation. What I'm getting at is once Tsukishima is capable of cutting Kenpachi, I think he will. I don't think there's much reason to believe Tsukishima isn't getting close enough to deal that decisive hit, partly because Kenpachi would probably want him to. Also in chapter 468, we see Tsukishima cutting Senbon Zakura's petals once Byakuya uses his Shikai, allowing Tsukishima to see and know every single one of Byakuya's techniques, and how to defeat them, as well as the existence of Senbon Zakura's safe zone, which again, like I said, that's how he gets the drop on Byakuya. But that's only the half of how busted Book of the End actually is. If Tsukishima were to lock blades with Kenpachi's Zanpakuto, does that count as cutting it if he's using that version of the blade as he clearly was here when he struck Senbon Zakura's petals, since it seemed to work there? If Tsukishima manages this, then he'll gain a complete understanding of how powerful Kenpachi's blade really is and everything it can cut. And, since Book of the End allows Tsukishima to essentially rewrite history, more accurately, he creates a branching timeline, basically, that he has complete control over. Once he's done that, he'll be able to make it so Kenpachi's Zanpakuto can't cut him anymore. But, on the other side, Kenpachi defies logic, and we've seen this many times. I could absolutely envision a scenario where Tsukishima successfully blocks Kenpachi's sword with his arm or something, which, shocks Kenpachi. But then Kenpachi cuts him anyway. just because he made himself stronger, similarly to how he manages to eventually cut Neutra, and similarly to how he manages to initially injure Gremmy in their fight. Anyway, that's a very roundabout scenario for if Tsukishima doesn't manage to cut Kenpachi straight away, but if he does, well, this becomes a different story, so let's look at what Book of the End might do to the captain, or more specifically, what it might do to Tsukishima. In his battle with Byakuya, Tsukishima uses Book of the End in a way that we've never seen before up until now, where throughout the arc, Book of the End is used to simply make Tsukishima a friend or a family member or something like that, someone with whom his victims would have a cordial or loving relationship with and would never dream of fighting. Tsukishima doesn't take that route with Byakuya. While I guess it's possible he could have implanted himself into Byakuya's past as a family member, instead he takes the role of someone who taught Byakuya everything he knows, and who trained with Byakuya diligently for many, many years, meaning Tsukishima has access to all of Byakuya's abilities, and knows how to defeat and overcome them, and is well aware of how Byakuya fights in his entirety. This is why the only way for Byakuya to eventually win was to fight like someone else, which involved endangering himself by bringing his blades into the safe zone, and then eventually by fighting in a more physical and visceral way, even going so far as to find joy amidst the thrilling madness of battle. Yes, it seems he took some inspiration from Kenpachi himself, perhaps. But I would say this was a smart route for Tsukishima to go down. Against someone of Byakuya's caliber, even if Tsukishima wasn't necessarily aware of that, making the mistake of not powering up and simply hoping that he just might not want to kill you because you were friends once, would have been a grave error. And instead, Tsukishima flexes the multi-dimensional power of his Fullbring. I've brought this up before, but I think people tend to overlook what makes Book of the End truly, completely broken. You see, when Tsukishima inserts himself into someone's past, his Fullbring essentially makes it so the lie becomes believable, so the narrative makes sense. When Tsukishima cuts Byakuya, he goes from being just a human with a special ability to being a super-powered Shinigami strength human with a special ability. Tsukishima himself becomes as powerful and as skilled as his false narrative character would be, if that makes sense. He becomes strong enough, skilled enough, fast enough, and more to actually be capable of being Byakuya's mentor, and even keeping up to where Byakuya is now, as seen with how Tsukishima is able to outspeed and outmaneuver even Byakuya's bankai, something no ordinary human in their right mind should be able to do, and he wouldn't have been able to do had he not succeeded in striking Byakuya initially. During their duel, Tsukishima has become so strong that his swing breaks Senbon Sakura in half, and as Byakuya remarks that his last 2 years of training have been worthless, Tsukishima notes that no, Byakuya did indeed get stronger, but he simply got just as strong to match. There is absolutely nothing to say. This also wouldn't apply to Kenpachi, and that's a terrifying thought. If Tsukishima managed to slash Kenpachi and inserted himself into Kenpachi's past as his mentor, as the person who taught Kenpachi everything he knows about fighting, and bear in mind, it doesn't matter if this person doesn't actually exist, because Tsukishima fabricates this role, Book of the End would simply make it so. This is different to the Visionary, which was limited by Gremmy's own capacity. Book of the End acts as a hard and fast rule, and Tsukishima is essentially just a conduit. He's just the receptacle for what Book of the End is doing. While the Visionary is stronger in the sense that it has no activation clause, aside from Grammy just needing to imagine something, Book of the End is stronger in that once used, once the activation clause has been successfully met, which is to cut someone, it seems to have basically no limits whatsoever. So if Tsukishima was to cut Kenpachi and take a similar place in his past that he did with Byakuya, he would learn everything. the strength and force of Kenpachi's swings, his kendo capabilities, the truth of his eye patch, everything that would be conceivable for Kenpachi to have revealed to a mentor to whom he was extremely close, including any potential weaknesses Kenpachi might have. Again, Book of the End is one of the most broken powers in all of Bleach, and that's why. Tsukishima can write his own story. That's the theme of his power. He is a total blank slate. So he can cut Kenpachi and write himself into Kenpachi's life in a way that transforms him into a genuine monster, in a way Gremmy could have never achieved with his own ability. The cool thing is that eventually, Tsukishima could maybe even make it so that he takes Unohana's place in Kenpachi's memory. But I don't think he would have time to do that, just as he didn't with Byakuya. In order to actually replace someone in a person's memory altogether, rather than just inventing a new character, Tsukishima has to forcibly implant those memories and override them. And that seems to only be possible after a person has been under his influence for a while and the current lie is unraveling, as was the case with Orihime and Chad. And even then, the victim's mind normally breaks once Tsukishima gets that far. So yeah, I think Book of the End is actually strong enough to give Tsukishima a fighting chance against Kenpachi, just as it did against Byakuya. The real question, though, is that enough for Tsukishima to actually defeat the captain? And well, I think the answer is no, albeit for a slightly different reason than was the case against Byakuya. As we saw in his fight with Byakuya, while Tsukishima has been powered up significantly, he's still only working with the data he has access to. The moment Byakuya tries something completely new, Tsukishima is thrown off. And that's the issue with using Book of the End in this way. Tsukishima might think he has an answer for everything, and might have some nebulous means of overcoming whatever his opponent can do through years and years of training. And presumably he can actually do that, though I would have loved to have seen how he would have actually overcome abilities like Shuke Hakuteken or Goke, for example. The biggest issue for him, even using Book of the End, is that the enemy he's facing still has their agency. As soon as they realize what's going on, they can change, even if it's difficult for them and puts them on the back foot. I've always really loved Tsukishima as a character. He's one of my favourite characters in the whole series, probably, and a lot of that comes from the fact that I do think that Book of the End is a very well thought out ability. It is multi-layered, it is extraordinarily powerful. I kind of like that it's so broken because unlike something like the Almighty, which is just ridiculous and has no conceivable counter outside of a magic arrow, and again, I don't hate the Still Silver Arrow, but it does come out of nowhere. Book of the End is a very clever power, and Byakuya finds a genuine loophole, essentially, a genuine opening that enables him to win, and I think that's awesome. And so yeah, that's precisely what happened with Byakuya. The captain began fighting in a way Tsukishima didn't recognize, by putting himself in harm's way and drawing his blades into the safe zone to strike Tsukishima in the one place he thought he wouldn't be hit. Whatever inherent weakness Kenpachi has in his fighting style, Tsukishima would be able to exploit. But if Kenpachi perhaps begrudgingly changed the way he fights, even for a moment, he might be able to land that all-important hit. Although Tsukishima would be well aware of Kenpachi's kendo prowess, he would be aware of the fact that if Kenpachi were to swing at him with two hands, it would be devastatingly more powerful, and would presumably have some kind of counter for that. It's kind of the same idea. Like, Kenpachi fights Neutra for ages in his normal style and eventually realizes that the fight is only going to end with him dying unless he changes his ways, and that's when he brings out Kendo. Tsukishima even goes so far as to mock Byakuya for thinking he can win their fight by fighting like that, by trying to battle in a makeshift way, and we see that Tsukishima is able to keep up with Byakuya's bankai, as I mentioned earlier, and even move a little faster than the captain, as he blocks Byakuya's hand from moving, causing the petals to shred his arm. Of course, although Tsukishima claims to be able to negate every single one of Byakuya's Kido. Again, it's tough to wrap your head around that, but the truth is that whatever that means, Tsukishima will be able to manifest it through Book of the End. Byakuya is eventually victorious, having reached out and grabbed a handful of his blade petals in the midst of the chaos, blasting them through Tsukishima's chest. Tsukishima, of course, didn't expect Byakuya to be able to fight like this, so ultimately, Kenpachi has two routes to victory. One, he needs to change how he fights considerably, and this is, I think, the least likely option of the two, though I think it's the more interesting. For example, if Kenpachi suddenly launched a Kido spell at Tsukishima out of nowhere, Tsukishima would have absolutely no way of dealing with it. But of course, we know that Kenpachi doesn't know Kido at all. So how else could he change up his fighting style in a meaningful way? Well, we know that Kenpachi loves to cut things, and that by inserting himself into Kenpachi's past, Tsukishima is aware of everything Kenpachi can do with the blade. So what if Kenpachi casts the blade aside for this particular fight? If Kenpachi were to try and take on Tsukishima using just Hakuda, while Tsukishima may have the physical strength necessary to counter the captain on a base level after having cut him, this seems like the kind of move that would completely throw Tsukishima off. I can see him in shock, raising his blade to try and block the attack, but Kenpachi just punches him square in the chest or the face, sending him flying. This works too if Tsukishima overpowers Kenpachi briefly like he did against Byakuya, and manages to cut Nozarashi in half, leaving Kenpachi with very few options at that point. Turning to Hakuda might be the captain's best bet, a little like how Ikkaku faced off against Shishigawara. However, the more likely option for Kenpachi, and like I said, the less interesting one, is that he simply becomes stronger than Tsukishima even as his mentor. This feels a little like how things went down against Lloyd in the first Quincy invasion. Lloyd's Shrift the Yourself allowed him to mimic Kenpachi's power at 100%, and yet Kenpachi kills him anyway, simply by becoming stronger than his copy because again he defies logic. While the captain notes that Lloyd was the only Sternritter in the invasion who was actually somewhat tough to take down, in the end he still managed it all the same. And so that's potentially the sort of thing we'd see here. Tsukishima seems to have the upper hand, but Kenpachi eventually overpowers him to his shock, with Tsukishima expressing that this isn't the kind of strength Kenpachi should have, to which Kenpachi says, probably with a grin, that he simply became stronger than he was. Another interesting point is what happens when Tsukishima is defeated. In chapter 473, after Byakuya blasts him through the chest, Tsukishima tries a last-ditch attempt at layering on an additional narrative, telling Byakuya that he's not just his mentor after all, but he in fact saved Byakuya's life at some point in the past, and so Byakuya owes him the same. Although the ability does actually work, and Byakuya agrees that he does indeed owe Tsukishima his life, in the end, the fact that Tsukishima was a personal enemy of Ichigo overwrote all of that, and as a result Byakuya was content with letting Tsukishima die. Obviously it's really nice writing that Tsukishima, a character who tortured and warped and robbed people of their bonds, was defeated ultimately by someone's bond being far too strong for even him to overcome, something he didn't understand, which is obviously awesome, but it's intriguing to think about this from Kenpachi's perspective instead. Like, imagine Kenpachi cuts Tsukishima down with a tremendous sword swipe, and the Fullbringer now lies dying on the floor. He then tries to tell Kenpachi that he's not just his mentor, but he saved his life once, so surely he owes him the same courtesy. Honestly, while we know Kenpachi likes and respects Ichigo, I don't know that he holds him in the same regard that Byakuya does, simply because their relationship hasn't evolved in the same way. That being said, Kenpachi also doesn't like finishing off his opponents. While I don't think he'd necessarily administer the killing blow, he would probably still leave Tsukishima there regardless, as I also don't think that Kenpachi would believe in dishonouring his mentor either by seeking aid for him. And considering how underneath all of this, Tsukishima is still just a human, well, he's probably going to bleed out before anyone can get to him. There is one additional point I want to consider that I think is quite fun before we wrap things up. Could Tsukishima somehow involve Yachiru in the battle? We know that Yachiru is hiding under Kenpachi's Hayori even when he kills Kiriko, so she should theoretically be here for the fight. And while I think Kenpachi would try to send her away as soon as the battle began, once Tsukishima has cut Kenpachi and gained that strength and skill, he could easily target Yachiru himself and try to turn her against the captain. Seeing Yachiru get between Kenpachi and Tsukishima, and Kenpachi having to slam the brakes on and divert his swings at the last minute, would honestly be a fascinating showdown to witness. Is there any universe in which Kenpachi even considers knocking Yachiru out, a little like Hitsugaya was forced to do so to Momo in the Soul Society arc? I don't think so, but I also think we'd see him genuinely furious for the first time if Tsukishima targeted Yachiru, and I don't think there'd be any coming back from that for the villain. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. As always, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. In the end, I do think that Kenpachi would be victorious. I think ultimately Tsukishima doesn't really have a means of winning this thing, kind of like he didn't really against Byakuya, because they have so much experience, and really the ultimate weakness of an ability even as broken as Book of the End in a battle scenario is that his enemies do still retain their agency, so they can alter their fighting style on the fly if they absolutely have to, and I think that's what Kenpachi would eventually be forced to do. But maybe I'm wrong, maybe you think I'm off base, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Perhaps there's something I'm missing about this potential fight, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do please let me know what you think, I'd love to read your comments down below. Alright everyone, as always, thank you so very much for watching. Remember to hit subscribe if you enjoyed this video today. Consider checking out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games. Maybe showing your support over there as well. And as always, I want to say a massive thank you and give a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, who all help to keep this channel going. I really do appreciate it so very much. If you want to take your support from me another step further, you can do just that to get your name in the credits just like this, and to get every single one of my videos absolutely free of YouTube ads. It all makes a huge difference, and I do greatly appreciate it. Alright everyone, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.